America and Japan, and the meeting is being recorded. So it's a pleasure to have all of you join us, and certainly a pleasure to be able to be joined by folks in Japan for this year's Midge Ayukawa Commemorative Lecture. I'm Jordan Stanger-Ross. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Victoria and an affiliate of the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives, both of whom are connected with the Midge Ayukawa Commemorative Lecture Series. And I'm also the principal author and the editor of one of the two books that we're going to be discussing this evening, Landscapes of Injustice, A New Perspective on the Internment and Dispossession of Japanese Canadians. Although we're not all of us in Victoria this evening, I'm going to start with the University of Victoria's territorial acknowledgement. And the university describes three purposes for its territorial acknowledgement. And I find those purposes compelling, so I'll mention them to you before offering that acknowledgement. The first is that the University of Victoria hopes that this acknowledgement will inspire those of us who have arrived in colonized land to think about where we've come from and the consequences of our arrival for the people who live here. The second, the university suggests that in naming the peoples whose traditional territories we inhabit, we're encouraged to learn more about those indigenous people of these lands. And third, the territorial acknowledgement can inspire us to think about a different and decolonized future. So maybe with those goals in mind, or each of us keeping one of those in mind or more, I'll offer the University of Victoria's official territorial acknowledgement. So the university acknowledges with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territories the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I want to thank the Midge Ayukawa, or the Ayukawa Commemorative Fund, which was established in 2013 by the University of Victoria History Department to honor the life and work of Michiko Midge Ayukawa, who dedicated the last decades of her life to studying and telling the history of Japanese Canadians and of women. Midge was raised in the Strathcona area of Vancouver until the age of 12 in 1942, when she and her family were uprooted to Lemon Creek. The family subsequently relocated to Hamilton, where Midge had a distinguished career as a scientist and raised her family. Returning to British Columbia in 1980, Midge went back to school, earning a history MA and PhD at the University of Victoria, publishing a landmark article on Japanese picture brides in the early 20th century, and her dissertation as Hiroshima Immigrants in Canada with UBC Press in 2008. I met Midge as a rather fiery conversationalist in the last years of her life and my first years of working in Japanese Canadian history, and she generously invited me to her condo, which was actually very near my home in Victoria at the time, and I would have tea with her, enjoy conversation, receive her sometimes somewhat cranky assessments of the discipline as well as our department, and benefit from her generosity in translating and really helping me to start to think through the history of Japanese Canadian dispossession. Midge was actually on the first grant application for Landscapes of Injustice, the project from which our book arises, and she died while we were still in the application phase. And I was, of course, very saddened with many of us at her passing, and regretful that she didn't get to see the grant funded or the project take off. But certainly she was instrumental in those early days. It was a real pleasure for me to get to know her, and so I'm very grateful to be able to participate in this lecture series in her honor. It's my pleasure also to introduce the other author whose work is going to be shared today on this call. Dr. Masumi Izumi is a professor in the Department of Global and Regional Studies at Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan, where she teaches North American Studies. Dr. Izumi researches Japanese American and Japanese Canadian wartime experiences, as well as their post-internment communities and trans-Pacific migration, topics on which she's published in both Japanese and English, and has the rare, I think, distinction of having two books come out within a year of one another in Japanese and in English on Japanese American and Canadian experience. Today she'll be talking to us about one of those books, The Rise and Fall of America's Concentration Camp Law, Civil Liberties Debates from Internment to McCarthyism and the Radical 1960s. Just a note on the format of the sessions before I turn it over to her. Dr. Izumi is going to talk about her book for about 10 minutes, and then I'll describe our book, Landscapes of Injustice, that's just come out. And then we're having an exchange between authors where Dr. Izumi will talk in response to Landscapes of Injustice, and I'll speak briefly in response to her book, and then we'll open to wider conversation. So I'm looking forward to this author meets author format of this session. And Dr. Izumi, please unmute, and I look forward to hearing you talk about your book.
Thank you very much, Professor Stanger-Ross, for the kind introduction. And also I want to thank Michael Abe for setting up this Zoom meeting. And I really want to express my deep gratitude for Midge Ayukawa Commemorative Fund and inviting me for to speak at this event. Midge was also a very dear friend of mine, and we were both at the were history students, PhD students at University of Victoria, and we had two very different mentors, both historians, one on Japanese history and one on Asian Canadian history, and we exchanged remarks about our mentors, supervisors, and also we had some very personal a conversation about our family histories and the community histories. So she was not only someone who could inform me about her research in Japanese Canadian history, but she was like a very, very dear friend for me, and I miss her so much. And I also translated her book, Hiroshima Immigrants, to Canada in Japanese. So I think one of the last conversation we had was, she told me how happy she was when she got the translation out in Japan. So I really miss her dearly. So my book, The Rise and Fall of America's Concentration Camp Law, this is based on my dissertation, and it's only talks about the United States, but I think I've also studied about Japanese Canadian history, including some of the legal history and legal background of how the Japanese Canadian uprooting happened. So I was very looking forward to talking with Professor Stanger-Ross about these two very tragic events in North American history. So, so my book, I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Actually, one moment, please. Oops. Share. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So, can you hear this? See the slide? Okay. So my book is titled The Rise and Fall of America's Concentration Camp Law, Civil Liberties Debates from the Internment to McCarthyism in the Radical 1960s. And this book explains the passage and repeal of the Emergency Detention Act, aka the Concentration Camp Law, which legalized preventive detention of a person who the government suspected might engage in acts of espionage and sabotage in the event of invasion, war, or insurrection. This law was Title II of the Internal Security Act of 1950, Title I of which enforced communist registration with the Attorney General. The Emergency Detention Act, or Title II hereafter, was a law passed during the early Cold War period in response to the intensifying nuclear race between the US and USSR and the heightened tension between the McCarthyist conservatives and Harry Truman's liberal administration. The law was never enforced before it was repealed in 1971, but my book elucidates how this law's existence itself seriously curtailed civil liberties in post-war America. So what is preventive detention? Preventive detention is a measure to protect internal security by restricting the freedom of a certain individual or a group of individuals based on the suspicion that those individuals might take actions that would threaten the security of a nation. It differs from criminal prosecution, which is based on actions already taken that violate existing criminal laws. Preventive detention required special detention facilities or concentration camps to house those who are apprehended. So what is the major historical precedent of preventive detention in the United States? It was the mass removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Title II was modeled after Japanese American internment. My book analyzes the entangled discourse of race, national security, and civil liberties between 1941 and 1971. Chapter 1, Alienable Citizenship, Race Loyalty, and the Mass Incarceration of Japanese Americans, explains Japanese American internment as a wartime measure of preventive detention. Japanese Americans were labeled enemy aliens and enemy non-aliens, meaning citizens, American citizens, and were put in concentration camps. And this policy was justified as special wartime measures because the military believed that there might be Japanese Americans who might be disloyal, but they could not differentiate between the loyal from the disloyal because of the cultural differences between the mainstream American society and the Japanese ethnic group. So they put everybody in concentration camps first, and then later forced Japanese Americans to answer a loyalty questionnaire, which included two crucial questions: whether they were willing to serve in the military and whether they would forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor. Those who did not answer yes to both questions were sent to this Tule Lake Segregation Center as potential renunciants of American citizenship. The rest were allowed to leave the camps and reintegrate into the society subsequent to indefinite leave clearance. While the government defended its decision, and the court also defended the government's decision by using the discourse of military necessity, the incarceration, even though the government and the court defended this policy, the incarceration of a racial group en masse disturbed those who administered the policy. The Supreme Court justices who ruled on its constitutionality were reluctant to give the military unrestricted discretion over civilians, even in wartime. The sense of guilt, ironically, led to liberal lawmakers in 1950 to draft a bill that allowed the government to lock up potentially subversive citizens in an emergency based on individual assessment instead of a racial or group affiliation. So Chapter 2 explains the legislative process in which Title II was passed. Ironically, Title II was a product of liberal lawmakers' attempts to defeat the communist registration and anti-immigration bill advocated by conservatives in Congress. Title II was drafted to set the rules for preventive detention so that the government could remove ostensibly dangerous persons from society and lock them up in camps while maintaining liberty for the rest of the American people. The bill's drafters modeled it after Japanese American incarceration, and they installed provisions to protect the detainees' rights in order to prevent the arbitrary detention of innocent citizens, even minorities. The drafters and sponsors of the bill included liberal lawyers and politicians directly involved in the administration of wartime incarceration or resettlement of Japanese Americans as government officials. Chapter 3, The Shifting Ground of Civil Liberties. McCarthyism, the FBI, and the Supreme Court of the Age of Concentration Camps elucidates how Title II contributed to the strengthening of the FBI as an internal security agency and also led to the construction of detention camps designated specifically for Title II in case the law was enacted. Throughout the McCarthy era, Title II also provided statutory justification for expanding the FBI's power of surveillance and creating a blacklist of potentially subversive persons. Contrary to the intentions of Title II's liberal drafters, the procedural protections of civil liberties provided by the law had limited effects. The FBI grew in size and influence as a domestic intelligence agency during the 1950s and 1960s, and the information it gathered was used for anti-communist congressional and state investigations. The list was also utilized to watch civil rights and labor activists. The Justice Department built 6 detention camps in accordance with the provisions of Title II. One of the camps was Tule Lake, which locked up Japanese Americans. The later chapters connect the Japanese American internment with the rise of political radicalism in the late 1960s. Chapter 4, Quiet Americans No More, the expansion of political dissent and the grassroots campaign to repeal Title II, explains how the campaign to repeal Title II started within the Japanese American community and spread to other groups. Chapter 5, Recommitting Civil Liberties, the repeal of Title II and the passage of the Non-Detention Act, explains the congressional process that ended the law. So I document how some Nisei activists initiated the Title II repeal campaign, creating an ad hoc committee within the JACL in Japanese American Citizens League in 1967. The repeal campaign was a precursor to the redress movement, as it set a stage for Japanese Americans to speak in public about their wartime incarceration experiences and connected Japanese Americans scattered across the country. Title II repeal campaign was also important because it helped Japanese Americans to share the memories of their oppression with other minorities that were also concerned about the reusage of concentration camps. 1971 not only saw the repeal of Title II, but the passage of the Non-Detention Act, which prohibited the construction of concentration camps in America. So writing history is writing in hindsight. So I tell this story about the passage of the Emergency Detention Act and the repeal of this law. However, I'm going to end the PowerPoint and sharing it. Okay, but today I am writing with uncertainty about tomorrow. Because we are witnessing the increase of discriminatory and hateful messages around issues such as immigration, security, labor, and public health throughout the global north. In the United States, the president keeps tweeting inflammatory and hateful messages and polarizing its people into his devoted supporters and adamant opponents. And this is inciting some violence, not just to Asian Americans, but also against each other, all Americans, I guess. The Japanese government is trying to induce a constitutional change to curtail civil liberties, and I know that there are different opinions about what to do with the Japanese constitution. I think it's also, we have to take note that the new proposed constitution has clauses that severely curtail civil liberties. And Canada is also struggling to grapple with its past oppressions and structural racism that continues to exist. So we know that allegations of mere suspicion of subversive future actions is the governmental apparatus for silencing dissent. And I delivered this book because of the concern about this time that we are living in, especially because we know that at the time when those in power propagate the idea that repression of liberty is necessary to keep us safe, we also have to be careful about what's the consequences of the limitation of civil liberties. So lastly, just want to go back to the slide just to promote another book of mine, which was introduced, which is Japanese Canadian Movement, A History of Japanese Canadians Migration and Activism, which came out in Japanese in Japan. And I am planning to get this published in English also, to make it available for my Canadian colleagues and friends. So, and English reading people. So thank you very much. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Izumi. We'll certainly look forward to reading that book in English as well. In 1942, the Canadian government uprooted and interned all people of Japanese descent living in Pacific Canada or within 100 miles of the Pacific coast, and promised to protect all of the property that they were forced to leave behind. Instead, officials stood idle as former neighbors looted and stole, vandalized. And then the next year, the government forced the sale without the consent of Japanese Canadian owners of everything for which they had assumed responsibility. As a result, when the internment era ended in 1949, Japanese Canadians had no homes to which to return. Their homes, farms, businesses, fishing vessels, cars, family heirlooms, even family pets, everything that they'd been unable to take with them was gone. So what happens if we look at the internment era in Canada primarily as the destruction of home? What if, rather than emphasizing the temporary uprooting and internment of people, we think of this primarily as an act of permanent displacement and the destruction of homes and communities? Our project, Landscapes of Injustice, from which the book I'm talking about today arises, has focused on answering that question since 2014. And the research of 4 years of the Research Collective, research that has served as the foundation already for a museum exhibition, for teaching resources, for elementary and secondary schools, for websites, and for a digital archive that will soon launch. All of that research is presented in Landscapes of Injustice, a new perspective on the internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians, which came out this year with McGill-Queen's Press. In addition to editing the book, I'm the primary author of much of it. It's the work of 15 contributors, and I co-authored with 10 different contributors in this book. I wrote with geographers, with a political scientist, with a folklorist, with other historians, and with a law professor. I wrote with graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, independent researchers, and distinguished professors. And it was a lot of fun, actually. The topic's not fun, but the collaboration was, and it was exciting. I now realize that I misspent my youth, my professorial youth, in solo authorship, and have come to feel that the meeting of minds and the convergence of different areas of expertise around a single topic and around particular sources, shared sources, is a key to advancing knowledge in the humanities and social sciences. These co-authorships, and a couple of my co-authors are here on this call, these co-authorships, meanwhile, are nested within a larger partnership from which Landscapes of Injustice emerges. And that partnership included academics from varied fields, museum and archival professionals, school teachers, Japanese Canadian organizations, and leading Japanese Canadians from across the country. And I think that environment of the project fostered a particular way of thinking about and of conveying historical injustice that's represented in our book together. The history is known to some members of our research collective through the sheer force of an injustice directly experienced and remembered. And we're perhaps the last large-scale project that will have had the opportunity to work with people who remember this history very well, and their presence on our project greatly enriched all of our work. Their various responses, which were sometimes optimistic, sometimes dark, sometimes humorous, have greatly shaped our experiences together as a partnership and the work that we produced. The stark injustice of the dispossession revealed itself especially when members of our collective, those members who lived through it, conveyed their experiences to the rest of the research collective. Mary Kitagawa, born Murakami on Salt Spring Island near Victoria, BC here, conveyed her family's experience to our research collective, describing the moment when her father was incarcerated in 1942 and she was 7 years of age. Mary told us, "We were prepared because a local official had told us we should be prepared to have my father taken away. So when the RCMP came, my father lined us up in our living room in order of birth and tapped us all on our head and said to Mom and the children, 'Now be strong, I'll be back soon,' and told us children to be good to Mom and to help as much as we could. And he went out and we followed him. And as he approached the truck, the RCMP officer told him to hurry up. And as my father was getting into the truck, the officer shoved him and my father fell onto his stomach, hit his face on the flatbed of the truck. But my father jumped right up to reassure us he was fine, and he kept smiling. 'I'm okay, I'm okay.' The girls, the four of us, ran after the truck, crying and waving and saying, 'Daddy, Daddy, come back.' And as he was disappeared, and as he was driven away, rather, he disappeared into a void. But in my 7-year-old mind, as my father was being taken onto the truck, I saw the gun in the holster of the RCMP officer, and I thought for sure that he was being taken because of the way that he was being manhandled. I thought for sure that my father was being taken away to be shot. And it was a terrifying, terrifying time. The book includes many stories of families like Mary's whose lives were irrevocably disrupted by the internment and dispossession. The revulsion that we feel at such accounts and the judgment that they inspire in us spring from truths indispensable in telling a history of injustice. We need those lessons from these pasts, and I think that the book Landscapes of Injustice conveys that sheer injustice of the era. At the same time, our project, one of the largest assemblages of academics ever to collectively engage a single topic in the Canadian past, sat with historical materials. We poured through records of the state and those preserved by members of the community. We traced title and 4 sites of study on real estate and 4 sites of study. And the result of that work is an analysis that could only have come from research. We linked more closely than any previous researchers the experiences of the Issei, the immigrant generation, and the dispossession that followed. We reckoned with the legal and administrative processes that made the dispossession possible, and in large part, at least, legal. We sought to understand on the basis of their own writings and perspectives what property, home, and the loss of both meant to Japanese Canadians. We identified key officials responsible for the policies and tried to understand why they did what they did. In the book, we tried to convey the tremendous complexity of the processes of state violence, the diversity of their victims, and the ambivalences of their perpetrators. Contemplating a very different historical injustice, but in ways that are instructive in our case as well, Ira Berlin reflected, if the evil of slavery was unambiguous, the lives of the men and women, both black and white, who lived through the era were as complicated as any. And that's a sentiment that I think pervades our book and the research that we've conducted. We try to convey the simultaneous complexity and simplicity of injustice. We commit to interweave the moral clarity of a sense of historical injustice with the complication and even uncertainty of historical research. In the end, all of this work converged in 4 key claims about dispossession that organize our volume into 4 parts, and that also, I think, may characterize dispossession more generally. The first is that dispossession involves the deliberate killing of home, that the destruction of home is a distinct harm within the larger acts perpetrated against displaced people. That dispossession requires sustained work is the second claim, that dispossession doesn't unfold in a momentary snap or panic decision, but rather requires years of administrative process, and that people being dispossessed suffer those years of sustained work. Our third claim is that dispossession requires reasoning, that the people who perpetrate it have reasons for which they undertake those actions, they articulate those reasons, and those reasons can be challenged and were in the case of the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. To understand why they did what they did, it's important to understand what they said about what they were doing. And also, finally, the fourth part of our book conveys the permanence of dispossession, that some things once shattered cannot be put back together again. And so that's my description of the book. And I really look forward, Dr. Izumi, to your response to it, after which I will respond to Dr. Izumi's book, and then we'll have some more conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'm really impressed with the scale of the project, and which engaged a number of experts from different fields, as well as student assistants in this thorough and interdisciplinary project. I also think the timing of the Landscape of Injustice project was crucial as we approach the 80th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, because this project provided with huge financial and human resources for a small minority community that was struggling to preserve its history. We are finding it more difficult to interview those who experienced World War II directly compared to the time when, for example, Midge Ayukawa did her research. The Landscape of Injustice project is the first comprehensive study of Japanese Canadian wartime persecution since the publication of Ango Masunahara's Politics of Racism and Pricewaterhouse report, The Economic Losses of Japanese Canadians After 1941, both of which became the essential documents for that contributed to the redress agreement between the National Association for Japanese Canadians and the Canadian government. Although it focuses, the Landscape of Injustice project focuses on the loss of property of Japanese Canadians, this book covers a longer historical period of time, from the time when Japanese Canadians left Japan all the way up to the redress agreement. I think Audrey Kobayashi's first chapter on what property owning meant culturally for the Japanese immigrants elucidates the breadth of the meaning of the term property in this project. The second chapter shows the precarious legal ground on which Japanese immigrants' citizenship status stood before World War II, which underscored the vulnerability of Japanese Canadians' livelihood, even though they worked really hard to purchase land, fishing boats, houses, stores, businesses, automobiles, and so on. Also documenting the actual experiences of dispossession by including individual family stories about how Japanese Canadians built up their wealth before World War II, how they survived their lives in exile during the war, and how they contested their dispossession during and after the war. The book highlights the magnitude of the loss, which was not limited to the financial aspect, but extended into the cultural and psychological realm. And I personally was particularly interested in the legal aspect of this project study, which can be compared with my studies on legal basis of the relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans. I explained in my book how American policymakers had to maneuver through the concepts related to national security and citizenship to justify the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. But in Canada, all the government measures were legal, and the court judged that they were within the realm of the cabinet's war power under the War Measures Act, and that this power was extended through the passage of the National Emergency Transitional Powers Act. So Chapter 8 explains the legal process of dispossession of property, tells how some Japanese Canadians challenged it, and how ultimately the court upheld the government's decision to break the promise of the custodian's role as a protector of the property. So I was kind of particularly interested in the details in this chapter, but also other chapters who deal with these legal issues on the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. I bring this up because I looked at how the laws are made. How can I say that? Like the laws okay, so these issues made me wonder about the relationship between the law and political intention in which the law is applied. So my book, as well as this Landscape of Injustice book, show the complex manners in which law works, like how these people don't necessarily intend to be maybe I would say that they were racist, but there are like different degrees of racism. Also, there is a lot of ambiguity about how to deal with Japanese Canadian minorities or Japanese Americans. But then these books show the complex manners in which law works, but it seems that the law is in the end utilized to accomplish the interest of those in power. So that these are the questions that I had, like a bigger questions that I had going through both books. So I prepared a couple of questions for Professor Stanger-Ross. How did you come up with this idea of launching a major interdisciplinary study of Japanese Canadian dispossession, and how is it related to your earlier study? So that is one question. And what were the challenges and accomplishments that you observed in the course of this project? And I recall that at the very early stage in which this project was proposed, some Japanese Canadians expressed concerns and reservations about digging into the history of the lost property. So how did you work with people and persuade them that this project was doable and also will be beneficial both for the JC community as well as for the general Canadian public? And you mentioned in the introduction, I think, that you had to work creatively within the space that tension creates. And if you could elaborate on that a little bit, I think a lot of people are interested in this issue. And then the last question is that there are efforts going on in Canada as well as in the US, but maybe more so in Canada, to bring some kind of reconciliation, between groups. In the light of Canadian racial oppression in the past. So do you think that the Landscape of Injustice project can bring some kind of reconciliation within the Canadian society? So, and in other words, in what way would you like to see all this data and information you accumulated in this project being used for by people who use your work?
Thank you. So now I don't get to answer any of those questions. I'll just reflect a bit on your book, and then we'll talk together. But thank you for them. So I'm going to comment on Dr. Izumi's book, The Rise and Fall of Concentration Camp Law, which is a book I enjoyed a great deal. It reflects, I think, as well, that balance of moral clarity and attention to scholarly detail that I think Landscapes of Injustice was aspiring toward. And I think you got a sense in Dr. Izumi's presentation of the rigor of the work. And this is rigorous, detailed historical work. And she gave you a feel just at the end there also of the passion that she brings to the project. So Izumi is a scholar, is a careful historical scholar who's fascinated by the contradictions, or what she says peculiarities, and she sometimes calls ironies, of the history of Title II, this authorization in the United States of preventative detention. And she finds these peculiarities or ironies in both its original passage in 1950 and then again in its repeal in 1971. So it's passed ambivalently by people who are also afraid of state overreach and who are in some ways seeking to prevent even more draconian measures. And then it's repealed in 1971, despite having never been invoked, and in Izumi's words, never likely to be invoked. And so she finds these ironies of a law ambivalently passed, never used, and then repealed. And that's the stuff of scholarly historical inquiry. And yet she also writes this book with passion, and it comes across especially in the introduction and conclusion, but I think that passion actually pervades the entire book. We have a sense that we're reading the work of someone who urgently cares about these issues. And one of the passages in the introduction in particular struck me for conveying this concern, where Dr. Izumi is talking about the possibility of essentially giving up in the face of the fears presented in the current political environment. And she writes, "But as an historian and as a parent, I know I have another choice, which is to write and act in order to prevent or at least postpone massive destruction, and to search for an alternative destiny for humankind." And that kind of writing you find throughout a book that is also so meticulous and rigorous in its work. And I think the layering of these facets of Dr. Izumi as a scholar make this book special. The two books, Landscapes of Injustice and The Rise and Fall, I started just calling it The Rise and Fall in my notes, but The Rise and Fall of America's Concentration Camp Law, are quite different from one another. Landscapes of Injustice is a kind of a dogged inquiry on a specific topic. And comparing them, I started to think of the image of a child on a beach overturning every stone. That's Landscapes of Injustice, trying to uncover everything there, everything that could be learned about dispossession. Whereas in Dr. Izumi's book, to perhaps overextend the metaphor, the child stands up, seizes a rock, and throws it into the pond and observes the ripples created by that stone. Watch those reverberations outwards. And that work that Dr. Izumi has done in this book is work that we still have to do, I think, in Canada, tracing outwards from the internment era to its varied reverberations in post-war society. In Canada, I think we know too little of this. We have too limited an account of how the dispossession mattered in other facets of Canadian history. We lack a full story of where it fits in. In Dr. Izumi's account, the incarceration law is not just an example, it's not just exemplary, it's not a lesson to learn from a particular moment, but rather it has a complex causal relationship with events that come after it. Indeed, the causal complexity is one of the pleasures of the book. I ended up drawing this kind of strange, circuitous path, sketching the fascinating causal lines of the book, where the incarceration era legal cases, the court cases, have impacts for post-war 1950 legislative discussions, which then have impacts on Japanese American activism, which in turn impact legislative decisions as well. Thus, the legal history of Japanese Americans is interwoven with the larger legal post-war history of the United States. And that's tied back in turn to the Japanese American community's own experience. I ended the book with a sense of many studies that might still be undertaken to answer many questions, both comparative and in each context, but I'll just name one of these. So I've returned repeatedly in my reflections to a sense of moral clarity, a sense of moral clarity that the incarceration was wrong in the United States. That Dr. Izumi documents there was wide consensus around that moral clarity, even early in the post-war period. And certainly the sense that the dispossession of Japanese Canadians was wrong is a clear moral sense that underlies the whole of the Landscapes of Injustice project. And it also was clear in Canada in the post-war period. And I wonder whether we need a more detailed history of that consensus. How is it that people came, in fact, to have that sense of moral clarity in both contexts or across them, that these wartime acts were wrong? How did that sense of moral clarity emerge? What have been its limits? So now we have a chance for Dr. Izumi and me to reply to one another and perhaps pose more questions, and then we'll just do that for a few minutes, and then we'll open to questions from the rest of the audience as well. And I know that some of you will go to two slightly more globally well-known speakers are debating one another at 6 o'clock my time. So some of you may be jumping to that. But Dr. Izumi and I will stay on the call for an extra 15 minutes if there are questions from the crowd. And if you really want us to start yelling at each other, Dr. Izumi's agreed to do that as well, to have the entertainment value of our competitors. But did you want to start off by reflecting at all in response to what I had to say, or?
Sure. I don't go over all the points that you made, but I think one, I think it was interesting, the metaphor you use about the different research style. I think we need both, that we need to uncover all these small shells, and that can only be done by a lot of scholars working on together. And I guess I'm joining the group for the next continuation of Landscape of Injustice project. So I'm very happy to be part of that bigger group, because I'm starting to work with other scholars in Japan in project in Mio village in Wakayama, or perhaps something we'll develop in our research in Hikone, Shiga, the local, working with local community. But I've been working on Japanese Canadian history for a long time, but this is just starting, and we always had the sense that we needed some kind of bigger project rather than individual scholars working on their own. So I think I think we have a lot to learn from the Landscape of Injustice, although we don't think that we will have such a big scale project, considering the material and environment that we have in Japan. Another thing is this moral issue, that where we stand, and looking at both Canadian and American legal debate, and also legal structure, which enabled the government to approach Japanese Americans and Canadians. I always had this question, like, okay, so which is more racist, Canada or the US? And so we can look at that, not today, but it's an academic as well as moral questions we have to deal with. And the consensus issue, I have thought, and I wrote in my book, that even the very right-wing media, including like the Fox News, consider Japanese American internment as something that was wrong, when someone who worked for the Trump administration said that, oh, we interned Japanese Americans so we can perhaps incarcerate Muslims and things like that. That was negated at that point. But in Canada, I'm not quite sure if there is a clear consensus that Japanese Canadian uprooting was wrong. There are still some like a national security or military historians who might contest that that issue. And also in the United States also, I'm not sure that we can take it for granted that this evaluation that the looking up Japanese, ethnic Japanese was wrong, that could last forever, that we think that we have the consensus now. But when we think about how these, some people seems to be openly think that racist is okay, right? Like, which was unthinkable, I think, maybe 10 years ago, perhaps. So so I'm kind of wondering about, and I think it's important to keep telling this story.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm conscious that we're near time, and I want to leave some space for Q&A with the rest of the participants. You asked really great questions, and I think both of us are interested in these ambivalences in the production of draconian law and the kind of anti-racism of racism and these kinds of dynamics. And that, I think, is really interesting. And you this wasn't one of your core questions to me, but what are we to make of the significance of these ambivalences if in the end the law seems to serve
Right.
to serve injustice? So I think one of the things I enjoyed about reading your book was finding someone else who's also interested in these ambivalences in the production of these laws. Just briefly, as far as challenges, I mean, so this was a big, this was a 7-year project, Landscapes of Injustice, that we're coming towards the end of, and really more than that, because it's a 2-year application process, and it involved a lot of funding and many organizations. So, I mean, I think I would just say, although it's a bit of maybe what may not feel like a full answer, but I would just say it shifted a lot in the course of it. The nature of relationships between Japanese and non-Japanese Canadians in the project, the relationships among within the community as well, Japanese Canadian organizations within the project, the relation between our community council, which was an arm's length community-based body, and the rest of our project. Our project was a very new partnership in the sense that many of us didn't know each other or have a sense of each other's intentions or background when we started. And so, it's my feeling that we were that the project was formulated in good faith to explore in a thorough way a key understudied facet of the internment. And as that became clear over time to more and more people, and more people got to know what we were doing and kind of came into the project's work, forms of reservation that existed at the outset dissipated to significant extent, at least. One of our collaborators, Audrey Kobayashi, said to me early in the project, this is a community in which trust is hard won. And I think that's very understandable, and that every time we got together, we were talking about the betrayal of trust and the betrayal of Japanese Canadians' trust. So it made sense to me that was the case. And I think in the course of the project, we came to trust that one another were there for the right reasons. That didn't mean that we didn't have significant differences of background and experience and opinion, and that's some of that tension that I was talking about in the introduction there. So I don't think we ever came to pretend that was not the case, or that I could see the internment the way that Mary did, or that she might see it in the ways that I do, but that we could work together toward a kind of good faith shared purpose. But there's more to say on that topic, I guess. But so let's try to open. I think Mike is going to be able to open it so that people can unmute, and because before now you haven't been able to unmute, so you could unmute and ask your question. Might be the most interactive way to ask a question. And like I said, we have only a few minutes, but Dr. Izumi and I will stay on till 6:15 my time to continue to ask questions. If other people need to go, we understand we ran a little over time in our own remarks. So we thank you for your attendance. But if folks have questions, I see a couple in chat. I don't know if others, if anyone who put a question in chat wants to unmute and ask their question directly.
I just want to know, like, your experience as you're researching for the books for both of you, if you had experience with people that didn't feel that the incarceration was wrong, and how did you respond to that?
I personally haven't really got into any kind of heated debate, even when I was doing my research in presidential archives, in different presidential archives or different archives in the US. Like all the archivists were really like thought that the issue was important, and they were very cooperative. And the one thing that comes to my mind is this tension in Canada. I think my work also have received sort of like negative review that I'm ignoring the fact that Canada was at war with Japan when Japanese Canadians were incarcerated, and at that time during the war, people I sort of was kind of accused of being presentist, that I'm bringing in moral issues. But for me, like I'm taking actually those fears and suspicions seriously in my work when I looked at how Japanese Americans work, and that people had a genuine fear about in national security and internal security, but at the same time they have like problem with the racism as well. So I think my work is trying to take that kind of the historic, in that historical moment people reacted in certain way, but I'm not justifying what they did. So I'm trying to document what happened, and what happened in 1942, how people felt in 1942 and 1944 is very, very different. Right? Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but right now I haven't met anyone who would think that the Japanese Americans or Japanese Canadians were not that it was justifiable that they were uprooted in turn. How about Jordan?
Well, our project in some senses began, I think, as an effort to shift away from that discussion, because the dispossession of property unfolds a little later during the war and then continues post-war. And no one argues, once Japanese Canadians are already uprooted and interned, no one argues that their houses rented to tenants or warehouses of their belongings pose a security threat. No one could argue that, and no one did. And so then, to answer the question, why was the promise of protection broken? The answer, security, that can't be offered really. So the initial impetus of the project was to move away from those discussions. It turns out that's not really possible in a sense, that whenever this topic arises, I think, especially in public settings, whether it's in an op-ed that we've put in the Globe and Mail, or when I've been on radio. I had one particular radio experience where I was on a call-in show and I felt like 1942 had dialed in and was, I was directly interacting with perspectives that seemed very archaic to me. Mm-hmm. And I've stopped, I'll say of those views, I'm not sure that perspective is that the mass internment and incarceration of people on the basis of race is justified. I'm not sure that's the view, but rather that it's somehow understandable in retrospect, or that we can't understand what it was like. So it's something different than saying, yes, we really ought to have done that. It has been presented to me, at least, as, well, we shouldn't judge it, which is a slightly different, I think, sentiment. I've ended up thinking that probably both kinds of conversations can occur. So one in which we push past those conversations and point out things like the dispossession of property was at a high point in 1944, when the Prime Minister had already indicated that it was the war was, for all intents and purposes, over. And so, they were planning for the post-war. Or that it continued after the war was over. Or that Canada's internment was mostly post-war, right? The internment laws banning Japanese Canadians from returning to the coast ended in 1949. So most of Canada's internment era is post-war, not a wartime policy. So you can have that while simultaneously accepting that maybe the conversation is forever dogged by this question of, well, what do citizens owe each other in a time of insecurity? What are actions that a society will take when it feels itself threatened? And maybe that just needs to be a kind of permanent, ongoing conversation alongside other ones that take other directions. There's a question here I saw about your cover photo that was up above. I think it's just it's a question. Asumi Oba is
yes, that's me.
There you are. Hi.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really great. I am doing master's in UBC. I'm doing art history, and I'm researching Japanese Canadian family photography. So, Dr. Izumi, I am really interested the photograph you chosen for your book. So yeah.
In the Canada?
Up and Rise.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for the Up and Rise of Japanese American Internment Incarceration.
The cover?
The cover photograph.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that one, I was especially interested in the background of that photography. There was a banner that says Indians welcomes. Yeah, right? So do you have any background information of that photography? Like when it was taken, where was it, and what was the context? So I'm really curious.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, that photograph is from Alcatraz. It was an Indian occupation of an American Indian movement. That's the activist group name. So AIM took over the Alcatraz Island. And if you see the photographs, I guess, Jordan, you see Repeal Title II. Right? So this is the scene where Japanese Americans gathering in San Francisco got like support food and water and items and blankets and things like that. And they brought these support goods to Alcatraz to support those Native American activists who were occupying Alcatraz Island. So and this, I only have like maybe like 3/4 of a page. I talk about that incident, but how this interracial coalition happened during the 1960s, and this is like a perfect image for this kind of minority supporting each other in quite a radical, like a philosophy, I guess. You're taking, you're recognizing that this is an Indian land, an indigenous land, and these people are taking over. And at the same time, Japanese Americans are talking about their incarceration. And they're basically the strategy was that they said this could happen to you. This had happened to other people, like an indigenous people, and this has happened to African Americans, and this could happen to you, and based on your dissent to the government. So yeah, and this was taken by a Japanese American photographer who was taking different photographs of the activism, but San Francisco-based photographer. So yes, thank you for the question.
That is great. Thank you so much.
We have some comments in the chat. Some are nice compliments and a discussion of a CBC podcast that I heard about, but I haven't heard the actual podcast. Then there's a question from Cam Teo for Masumi.
Wait, where is it?
Is Cam here?
Hello, good evening. This has been an excellent presentation. Dr. Izumi, as a non-North American and as a person from Japan, how do you feel your background, how do you feel that this dynamic from your background brings to your scholarship?
Thank you for your question. I guess one thing is I'm an American Studies scholar. I just happen to be one because I'm interested in the issue. So I'm not sure. I'm not quite aware why or how my being non-North American affects my work. But this concern about the civil liberties and government repression of dissent, that has been a very important political issue as just a person. So that's my what drives my work and how I look at what's problematic in history. But if I just add my personal history, my father was born in Manchuria. And so he kind of, our family did experience in a way migration, but I was never aware. I always knew that my father, was born in Manchuria and returned as a sort of this historical contingent that we were part of the colonizers and things like that. But I haven't figured out why that drove me to Japanese American studies. I don't really see the connection. So yeah, I'll prepare for a better answer in the future. But one thing, maybe I can add that when I was doing my research with all these Japanese Canadian and Japanese American activists, I see some of you in this Zoom talk as well. I had a great time because we seem to have common interest and concerns. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Are there other questions? You can unmute or raise your hand in the chat or as in the participants area. I think, is Wendy unmuted?
Yeah, I unmuted. I sort of tried to put in things in the chat. I was picking up my child before, so. But I have worked before on some civil rights issues when I was in the States. So I worked on both sides of the borders. But if people have the time to see the Norman Mineta documentary, which was shown at VAF last year, it might be available through PBS. It's quite interesting because it's from his perspective of having gone through the Japanese American internment, and then also being part of governance. And he didn't expect to it, he backed into it, but he was like a mayor of San Jose, and then he was the congressman, and then he was Secretary of Transportation in both the end of Clinton and then George Bush Jr.'s administration. And it was really important because I remember one of the big points is that, because he was there, he was a living memory in the face of George Bush right after 9/11 to say, hey, we can't let what happened to Norm's family happen to other Americans, right? And so I think it's really important that you keep laying out all these things that happen, particularly, as our older generations, the ones who actually lived this history are no longer to share it in person, because it's very easy in this day and age, I think, for people to believe in conspiracies and have very short-term memory, and so I think it's really, great that you are looking at it analytically, and as well as just putting down, pen to paper, whatever storytelling, whatever format to capture these stories, so that it's harder and harder for people to say, no, that didn't really happen, and it's good that you share it, because clearly not enough of us know this history, you know, and we need to share it with the younger generations to say, yes, even in Canada, this can happen. So.
Yeah, and Dr. Izumi's book does a great job of those connections. She has this a great line towards the end of her book where she's laying out the what could have been fissures, political fissures amongst folks who sought the repeal of Title II. And she asked, well, how did all these diverse perspectives converge into a political movement? Well, one of the answers was the presence of Japanese Americans, that everyone could recognize, okay, this can happen. We could preventatively detain people unjustly. We have preventatively detained people unjustly in this country. So this is and that was played a role in drawing that political momentum together. So and your conclusion, Dr. Izumi, really draws up to the present day and carries into Trump's presidency and through 9/11 and the place of this history among those.
Thank you very much. We'll take more questions.
We might have time for one more question if there is one.
If not, I just want to respond that I think it's really great that younger generation Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans are taking lots of different projects through art, through documentary filming, artistic filmmaking, and interviewing the elders, and as well as doing like historical and other scholarly research. So. And also Japanese Canadians and Americans are raising voice, you know, in political issues. I think they are getting more and more vocal, which is, I think, very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great note on which to end. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to Midge for her role in both of our research careers, and to the Commemorative Fund for making these events in recent years. And thank you, Dr. Izumi, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and to everyone for sticking with this programming. So good night, everybody, or good day, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. It's great.
Thanks. I'm glad that there's a great turnout. Take care and have a good day in Kyoto.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very informative. Have a good night or good day. I'm having a good night. You have a good
Hi,
day.
Mary. How are you? Tracking.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.
Nice to see you. Thanks for all the support you give us.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And I like Facebook for staying in touch.
Yeah.
Take care.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Let me take this recording.